Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Again, I'm Jack Zemlicka, Managing Editor of Strip Till Farmer, and today's live webinar event will provide some tips and techniques for strip tillers ahead of spring planting this season. Today's event is being brought to you and other pre-registrants free, courtesy of Topcon Agriculture. So, strip tillers often talk about the need to be more sensible with their seed placement and planter setups to create an increasingly responsive environment for initial plant growth. But how are farmers turning those several inches of optimal planting space into higher yields and lower seed costs? Hitting or missing that target planting zone can be the difference between a bumper crop and disappointing yields. During today's live webinar event, sponsored by Topcon Agriculture, West Brooklyn, Illinois strip tiller Dave DeLotel will share some of his practical and progressive preparations prior to getting into the field this spring. This will include an experience-based example and lessons learned with equipment setups, technology fine-tuning, and creating an annual checklist of strip till musts. So before we begin today, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If for any reason your internet connection or our connection should happen to fail at some point and it looks like the webinar has been interrupted, just go back to the email you received earlier telling you how to join the webinar, and you can re-enter the program that way. Also, on your screen, there is an arrow you can click on that will open up a question field and allow you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. Time permitting, we'll look to answer as many of those submissions as possible following the presentation. And I know we've gotten a few in, but if we don't get to all of them, we'll make sure to get them to Dave and post his responses on our website, along with the archived video replay of the webinar, so you can go back and review it again if you'd like. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dave DeLotel this morning. So good morning, Dave. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Jack. Um, my name is Dave DeLotel. As some of you may know, my name might sound familiar with different places, but I'm going to just jump right to the intro slide here. My dad and I farm in a partnership in northern Illinois. We're about 40 miles south of Rockford. We started no-tilling in the early 2000s because there was a lot of changes around that time with the local NRCS and several organizations like that. We started strip tilling in 2010, and we spent the next several trying to play around with that and trying to figure out what's the best direction to go and things of that sort. In 2013, we went what I would call full bore into it. That was the year we went 100%. We started adding cover crops and things of that sort into the mix. And like anything else, it takes time to reach your goals. And in 2017, our first year that we finally eliminated all broadcasted fertilizer and banned 100% of everything, which was quite a task to finally be able to reach that. The biggest point about this presentation that I'd like to make is some of this stuff that I'm going to go over might be elementary to some of you or most of you, but I'm just trying to cover all the basics and everything of that sort. And I'm going to try and share as much of our experience that we've had, stuff that we've learned the hard way and stuff you can maybe avoid before you go to the field this spring. So we'll jump right into it here. I want to start out by giving a brief overview of pretty much any strip till system in general. Probably the biggest point I'd like to make is strip till is a much more demanding environment than conventional tillage, meaning we expect a tremendous amount out of our equipment as compared to we did before, if that kind of makes sense. Because of that, flaws will be found sooner, sometimes almost immediately. And what I mean by that is, trash problems that weren't a problem in conventional tillage, for example, are going to show up in strip tillage, especially when you're trying to do corn on corn and things of that sort. Or maybe you're trying to plant into some fall strips that are a little bit lumpy or a little bit hard. There's going to be some modifications and things to look at. And the biggest thing is whether you're strip tiller or conventional tillage, it really doesn't matter. But as equipment gets bigger, these mistakes can be spread across more acres quicker. And that's a real point that I want to point out here. Anymore with 24-row planters and the equipment that we have at our disposal today, it really doesn't take as long to plant corn today as it did 10 years ago. So if it takes 10 minutes to stop and fix something or correct something, just do it, because there's no reason to leave a machine as such. I'm going to go over this, kind of briefly go over this checklist here, and then there's a couple of points that I have some pictures on and things of that sort that we're going to go into a little bit more detail on. This is typically what we try to look for in both of our plants, looking at things in the winter. And there may be one or two things missing on this list, but one thing I would like to know, if anyone would like this list in kind of a checklist type format, please shoot me an email, which I will be able to do this, and I'd be happy to email the checklist that we've got to any of you guys out there. So we always like to start off with the disc openers, which are, in my opinion, the most vital part of the planter. That's going to be what's going to form your seed trench and make sure that that seed is placed at the optimum depth. Next thing is, and this is kind of a one of the big things that we really didn't think about when we first started no-tilling several years ago, but we learned the hard way, is go around your whole entire planter with a handful of zip ties and check for any loose, low-hanging wires or hoses or anything. If there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this checklist, it's this. Because as many of you know, or maybe you guys have been in this experience before, if you break if a harness gets cut or torn up, or a wire gets pinched or something like that, it can probably be one of the most irritating things to fix. Additionally, in regards to hydraulic hoses, if there's a hose that's getting wore out and you don't realize it, and it happens to rupture while planting, you can lose several gallons of hydraulic oil, plus mess up your planter, plus you have downtime to fix it. So it's, like I said, it's kind of one of the most important things that I try to do. Your seed tubes, obviously check for wear at the bottom of those and see if your frog is getting wore or anything like that. Good look at the closing system and make sure that the wheels are in line with the seed trench, and make sure that the springs are and everything of that sort. And as we discussed previously, strip till is a little more environment than other tillage systems. So as you guys look at your planters before spring, maybe it might be time to consider an upgrade to your closing system, such as a different type of spiked wheel or something like that. Next, obviously, I think this is pretty elementary for most of you guys, is run the meters on the test stand and make sure to replace any parts necessary. Obviously, you're going to want to grease your planter. Something else on this next bullet point that these next couple bullet points that people may not think of is, check, double check, triple check all of your planter profiles, calibrations, etc. on your precision farming displays before you go to the field. Also, I would make a point to make sure everything is in the latest firmware and everything works correctly before you go to the field. That's a very, very good point that can cost a lot of irritating downtime in the field. And obviously make sure your hybrids, clients, fields, everything's loaded correctly on your display so you don't have to mess around with anything like that. And like I said, the rest of this stuff is a little bit elementary, like checking for loose bolts, worn hydraulic hoses, run some water through your fertilizer system. Here's one though that kind of gets me every year is I always kind of like to go around and spin all my road clears and check for play in the bearings and things of that sort, because in my opinion it's easier to take a road cleaner out when you're sitting on a cement floor versus out in the field with minimal tools. And then obviously we want to make sure all of our tire pressures are up to snuff. I'm going to start the disc openers. because this is the most vital point of the planter in my personal opinion. Um, without a proper seed trench, seed placement will suffer. Just as a reference, new openers, at least from John Deere, measure 15 inches, and we like to replace them at somewhere between 14.75 and 14.5. But the biggest thing to remember is that it's always a good idea to re-shim your openers every year. I'm sure most of you probably know the business card trick, where you place 2 business cards in the opener and put them down to where they contact, and the spot between the business cards should measure between 1.75 and 2 inches or so. And like I said, we typically re-shim our openers every single year. In certain soil types in certain regions, such as up in Michigan, where the soils are a little bit sandier and more abrasive with more rocks, you may actually have to consider replacing your openers every year. For example, we actually did this for several years when we had a little bit smaller planter, just because of the more acres per row that we were putting through it. But like I said, it's definitely something to not overlook, and make sure that they're properly adjusted every single year before you go to the field. Okay, I'm probably going to spend more time than I should talking about checking your hoses and wires, but like I said, with the miles and miles of wire that we have on these planters nowadays, and the hundreds of feet of hydraulic hose, and when you take into consideration that you might have 4, 5, possibly 6 outlets running in continuous at all times, there's so much oil flowing, and there's so many things that can go wrong. And like I said, we've been in situations where we've had a hydraulic hose go bad and basically empty the tractor out in the middle of the field. So that's something that I wouldn't want any of you guys to go through. So like I said before, a broken wire is worth hours of frustration and lost production. Corn stalks. So when we start talking about corn strip till and no-till and things of that sort, corn stalks are especially hard on harnesses and hydraulic hoses, especially. I know there's a lot of strip tillers that like to cut their fields a little bit higher, so obviously those stalks can get up into the row units and rub on your wires and hydraulic hoses, things of that sort. My best advice is, when you think you need 1 zip tie, use 2 or 3 when it comes to wires and hydraulic hoses, just to keep everything up out of the way, and to ensure that you don't damage anything. Like I said, worn hydraulic hoses not only pose a risk to productivity, but also safety, especially if you're going around and you're might be making some adjustments while a hydraulic drive is engaged or something of that sort. Like I said, your hose could rupture and you could be standing next to it, and it's just not something that you'd want to experience. And remember, if you do see a hose that looks like it's getting worn, just replace it. It won't fix itself; it'll only get worse. I've got some pictures here in the next couple of slides. My biggest thing is, if the rubber coating is worn off the outside of the hose, you can see the wire, then it's time to replace it. The outside rubber is just as much for strength as it is for protection. That's kind of something I've learned the hard way in the past. You might see a hose that's got the rubber worn off the outside, but you think, oh, the wires are still there, it'll be fine. But usually it's not very long after that the hose will rupture and break. Next couple pictures are just how I kind of like to see planters look before they go to the field. Off to the right hand side there, you can see that all the wires are tucked up in the side of the parallel arms and are secured with multiple zip ties and things of that sort. Off to the left hand side, one thing that I'd like you to kind of take a really close look at, if you can see it in this picture. This picture is the fertilizer tubes that we're using for our capstan system that go down to the, they basically are welded to the frog at the bottom of the seed trench. And take note that little piece of sprayer hose that I've got zip tied on that hose. That line would have actually been rubbing on that bolt there. And obviously if it sits there and rubs, it's going to eventually wear a hole through it. So that's something on our planter, for example. If you look close, you'll see sprayer hose tied to a lot of different things just to make sure that nothing gets a hole rubbed in it or anything of that sort. So it's just another one of those extra steps that you can take before you go to the field just to ensure that you don't that you keep your downtime to a minimum. Another nice thing that we did to our planter that I kind of like, and I think I've seen some variations on several different machines in the past, is we ran a piece of PVC down the down each side of the planter of the draft tube that we run wires through and stuff like that. The nice thing about this is it keeps the wires protected and kind of keeps them from getting pinched or falling down and getting caught in the frame when we're folding and unfolding. So yeah, like I said, you'll also notice too that any hydraulic hose is tied up where it should be. It's not hanging down in front of the frame. We bought this planter when it was a couple of years used, and believe it or not, those hydraulic hoses running along the front of the frame were actually all below frame length and kind of hanging all over. So that was one of the first things we did, is just went around and tied all those up to where they were supposed to be. Like I said, if you've got a hydraulic hose or any wire hanging down a corn stalk, we'll find it. On that note, I will say one thing that we did that really helped with that situation is we put a Yetter stock devastator on our corn head this year, which flattens everything to the ground. And I noticed even drilling covers this fall was actually quite a bit difference in even the wearing the paint off the frame and stuff like that when we're trying to plant. One of the other things I kind of started doing, as I mentioned, there's on any modern planter, there's a lot of hydraulic hoses, there's a lot of wires, there's just a lot going on. So I ended up on both of our planter tractors, I built these nice little brackets that either run the hydraulic hoses below the 3-point hitch or above it, just to kind of make sure that everything stays out of the way. And then off to the top right picture, you'll notice I always try to make sure that if there's any sort of protection around a hole where some wires and hydraulic hoses will go, I always try to make sure that all that stuff is intact. I don't know if I included the picture in this presentation or not, but there was a similar place on the planter off to the top right there where that piece of rubber protection was actually gone. And it would be that hydraulic hose in the picture right there. It was actually worn almost all the way through. And one thing to note, obviously, as you guys know on any of your planters, it seems like most of these hoses are 20 to 25 foot long and are pretty difficult to replace. So it was really kind of nice to find that problem ahead of time and actually be able to replace it in the shop rather than out in the field. And like I said, the bottom left-hand picture is a perfect example of if you think you need one zip tie, use 3, because it doesn't. Improperly tied hoses and wires, it doesn't take long for them to start dragging on the ground, especially when you're going through corn stalks and stuff like that. So it's always a good idea to make sure that everything's tied up to where it needs to be. The other thing is, whenever you're installing, I know it's pretty common nowadays to install a lot of aftermarket stuff on planters. The biggest thing that I want to note here, because this is something that I found out the hard way, is if you'll notice in the bottom right-hand picture, I've got all the wires run. It's always a good idea to run your wires as close to the factory hydraulic hoses and the factory wiring harnesses as possible, just to make sure that everything stays away from pinch points and things like that. And it's always a very good idea to have a couple people watching the planter the very first time that you unfold it for the year, just to make sure that you left enough slack in the proper places and things of that sort. And like I said, this is something else that we learned the hard way. There was, not on this planner, but our previous planner, I had put a bunch of stuff on, and the planner was folded in the shop, and I didn't take into account that obviously certain things are going to move when it unfolds, and I ended up having to put a whole new wiring harness on that planner because of that. So like I said, some of this might seem elementary to some of you, but like I said, if you can pick up one thing from any of this, I'd like it to be that. So the next picture here, another critical adjustment is the clearance between your gauge wheels and your disc opener. This is something that, again, something that we go along and we do every single year before we go to the field. As you can see, I always try to adjust those to roughly an 1/8 inch or so. The reason that this is so critical, in my personal opinion, is if it's too far away, you're going to get soil and residue and things of that sort caught up in there, and eventually you'll just sit in there and collect until your gauge wheel stops turning. One other thing I'd like to note about this picture: these disc openers are exactly 1 season old, and they measured correctly, so we're not going to replace them for this year. But notice how they still have a nice sharp edge. As some of you know, if you have the unfortunate experience of farming with rocks, there are certain batches of these disc openers that can get beat up pretty quickly. So that's another thing to consider. Even if your openers measure within the proper dimension, if the edges are all beat up or nicked or something like that, then in my personal opinion, the openers ought to be replaced. As another thing to note on the openers, depending on what brand you use, it's also a good idea to inspect the rivets on the hub itself, just to make sure that none of those are loose or missing or things of that sort, just to make sure that you can prevent a problem before it happens, is always our biggest thing. I'm going to touch just a little bit on inspecting your closing system. Like I said, it's a good idea to check the alignment with your seed trench. The adjustment varies by planner. I've been on several different planners where some of them have a little bit of a elliptical thing that you can kind of adjust your closing wheel frame side to side. I've played around with a couple different things where I'm actually shimming the wheel itself in or out to kind of compensate for wear or anything like that, to kind of keep our closing wheels right in the center of the seed trench. The other thing to note, like I said, if your closing wheels are worn, it may be time to consider an upgrade. And this is going back to being in a strip till system. The conditions that we're given are a lot more demanding than typically what a lot of these planners are set up for. So for example, you'll see on this planner, we've got the Yetter poly spikes, and we've been very, very happy with the upgrade. In fact, we wish we would have done something a little bit sooner. But like I said, if your closing wheels are getting a little bit wore out, or it's time to put new bearings in the centers, it's probably a good time to consider an upgrade if that's something that you feel you need. Going down our checklist, the other thing that I like to do is go into our displays and check the overall measurements of everything. So like the things I always look for is obviously, your implement width is pretty general, but make sure you have your front and back settings. I should say front and back measurements correct and everything like that. The biggest thing is if you don't have your front and back measurements correct, then obviously your row clutches and things of that sort are going to suffer. Also, make sure to check that you have the correct implement offset loaded in. Now, what I mean by that is depending on the machine and depending on how well it was manufactured, believe it or not, not every single planter frame is welded perfectly out of the factory. You may need to put an offset in your display to keep your planter tracking straight. This is especially important if you're not using any type of implant steering or anything like that. Pretty much, I would say 90% of the people that I've worked with over the years, they've all had to put some sort of an offset in their display to keep their planner tracking correctly. Now, if that hasn't been your experience, then it is possible that you probably just have a planner that tracks a little bit straighter. And like I said, if your planner doesn't need an offset at all, make sure that there is not an offset in there. This is actually at my previous job. This is something that I got support calls on a lot. Is customers would have an offset in their display for whatever that didn't need to be there, and their planner would be tracked. Here again, when your planner's not in the spot where it needs to be, obviously you're not going to be hitting your strip, and your vehicle will suffer as a consequence. Like I said before, it's also good to double check your drive calibrations and drive configurations if you have hydraulic drives on your planner. Most precision farming displays will have the option to where you can either run your planner in manual mode or run it in some sort of a test mode to make sure that the drives are operating correctly and make sure that your feedback sensors are communicating correctly. Like I said, 9 times out of 10, if something is wrong or something is not quite right, this is the best way to find it before you go to the field. And like I said, it kind of goes back to it's always a lot easier to replace something at the farm than it is out in the middle of the field. And probably the other big point that I would like to drive home with you guys is after you've double checked your measurements, after you've done your drive calibrations and things of that sort, perform a backup on everything. So back up your not only make sure that your implement profiles are saved to your displays, but also make sure that everything is backed up on a thumb drive. Because there again, this is something that we've kind of had to learn the hard way in the past, is if you have a display that for whatever reason decides to go down in the middle of the season, all of a sudden you could be scrambling to try and get your planner measurements in, try and get your drive calibrations correct, things of that sort. And then unfortunately, when you're in a hurry, stuff does not always get done the most accurate way possible. So by having that backup somewhere in the office, it's a good idea. It's if a display does go down, it's pretty easy just to go grab your backup, throw it in the display, and you're up and running again. And one thing I would like to note about the backups is, this is a little off topic, but it's something that I would encourage all of you guys to do when it comes to backing up your displays, is not only have it backed up on a thumb drive, but also consider getting something like Dropbox or something like that, so you have a place basically, off your computer somewhere else where your data and everything like that is safe. Because we all know that at some point in time we've backed stuff up on flash drives, and then of course it's hard to say where the flash drive is now at this point in time, or at least maybe I'm the only one that's ever happened to, but just something to think about. This picture is the screen that I was referring to earlier about running your planner in some sort of a test mode. Just for example, on our system, it's kind of nice because you can actually put in a target speed and target rate, and it'll basically simulate actual field conditions, and you can even go through and turn your sections on and off to make sure that your clutches are working, and everything like that. And then obviously you can check your hardware, make sure all that's communicating, and all that good stuff. So like I said, it's just something to think of. I've seen too many situations where everybody kind of pays attention to the mechanical side of things and kind of forgets about the electronic side, and it's not really a lot of fun going to the field and then figuring out all your electronic problems. It's always nice to have those done ahead of time. that's all I had on the planner for the time being. I'm going to move into the strip till machine for getting ready to go to the field. Excuse me. Number one, this is probably the most important point um, in this presentation, to be honest with you, is check all the bearings on all row units and replace as necessary. The biggest reason I want to say this is because with pretty much any strip till machine on the market, they have a tremendous amount of bearings in them. So obviously on our machine, for example, there's 4 different hubs on each row unit for the ground engaging components, and obviously there's 2 bearings in each hub, so that's always to have fail at any given time. So what I like to do is go through and kind of roll each coulter individually and see how it feels. You can kind of tell when a bearing's starting to go out if it kind of rolls in kind of a more jerky motion. You know that you've got some issues. More than likely, either the cage is broken and the rollers are about to fall out, or the rollers are just plain old worn out. I've seen that before, where the finish on the rollers starts to flake away, and then the hubs don't roll as good as they used to. And like I said, I think this is pretty elementary, but it's a good idea to grease all your hubs, or if you've got a machine like the Soil Warrior, replace your oil in the hubs before you go to the field. I know they recommend, I think, once a year, once every other year, or something like that. But if we're using this machine spring and fall like we usually do, we'll change them before we go to this field in the fall. Before we go to, like I said, it doesn't take that long, and it doesn't take that much oil. Just kind of we'll live an insurance policy. The next big thing, and this is kind of something that I learned the hard way over the years, is check all of your fertilizer hoses for wear. And the best way to do this is anywhere fertilizer hose makes a turn is more than likely the first place where it's going to wear out. The other place where probably the second most likely place where it's going to wear out is if you have a hose that goes across, that more than likely rests on top of a frame somewhere. As it sits and vibrates or moves back and forth, it's going to more than likely wear a hole after a while. But I would say most likely point to fail is definitely where the hose makes a turn. Usually a 45 or a 90-degree turn is probably the worst, because the fertilizer just hits that corner and just sits there and obviously grinds away at it. And the bad thing is if your hoses do start to deteriorate, most of the time your blockage sensors won't even pick this up, because you still have most of the product going through the hose. So before you catch it, not only are you going to have a couple rows that are going to suffer from lack of product, but you're also going to cover your machine in fertilizer, which is not always the best thing. The other thing I always like to check is I always like to check the bearings and the meters, mostly because they seem to be the ones that fail first, just because they're so close to the fertilizer at all times. And they're only, it's like a $6 or an $8 bearing if you go to your local farm store to pick them up. So I mean, it's not like they're that big of a deal to replace if they need to be. And like I said, like I kind of said with the planters, is check, double check, triple check your meter calibrations, profiles, etc. on your precision farming displays. And like I said, here again, that's very, very important, because if you've got your gear ratios for your drives in there, you've got your motor calibrations, you've got your implement width, you've got probably if you're running implement steering, you've got that profile in there. It's just a very, very good idea to go through and double check and make sure everything is there like it should be. And like I said, after everything works, perform a backup just to make sure that if you have a display that goes down, you don't have to spend the time to redo all those calibrations and everything. And the other thing is, and obviously elementary to some guys, but I always like to do a dry run before filling with fertilizer for the first time in the spring. There was, if I remember correctly, there was only one time where I didn't do a dry run for whatever reason. I think I was more than likely in a hurry or something like that. And we ended up having to unload 7 tons of fertilizer out of the machine because I don't recall exactly what went wrong. I think one of the individual meters was cracked, and I think it deteriorated and kind of got stuck in there. So like that's something that if I would have done a dry run, I could have easily prevented that. The other thing that's actually not on here, but I'd like to make a point of, is one of the things that I really, really like to do before I take the strip till machine to the field, or any piece of equipment that applies fertilizer in that retrospect, is I like to spray it down with a mixture of oil and diesel fuel before we start. So it's really, really not special. Just I take a little garden sprayer and fill it half full of diesel fuel and half full of just cheap generic hydraulic oil, and I spray the whole entire machine down. And the thing that this helps with is obviously it forms a barrier between the metal and the fertilizer dust. So basically the fertilizer dust is just going to sit there and float on that film of oil, and it's not going to rust your machine out. And the nice thing is, when it comes to cleaning the machine up at the end of the year, you essentially just spray it down real quick. You don't even have to hardly scrub it because you have that film there, so it cleans up very, very nice at the end of the season. And then in addition, when I put it away, it's always nice to spray the machine down again with that same mixture, just to prevent rust while it's sitting in the shed. And that's actually something that I just started doing here within the last couple of years, because if you look to this picture off to the left here, you'll notice obviously how rusty the coulters are and everything like that, which isn't a huge deal. They'll shine back up, but it's since I started spraying the machine down before we put it away, there's basically no rust on the machine whatsoever, which is nice when you go to the field for the first time, because you don't have soil sticking to the coulters and it's not making a good strip and everything like that. So it's just kind of one of those things that that I started doing to prevent more headache when we go to the field. That's all I have for the strip till machine for the time being. Just a couple of points I'd like to make whenever it comes to doing the preseason inspection on your tractors. Now, obviously, this list is a lot longer than this, but I left out kind of the general stuff, like, obviously changing the oil, checking air filters, things of that sort, because that's pretty common knowledge. But here are some of the things that I do above and beyond that. The biggest thing is check the steering performance in general. So it's always good to go out and strike an AV line and go back and forth and just make sure that the tractor just steers good. Even though you may have put it away and everything worked correctly, that doesn't mean that that's going to be the case when you go to the field. You'd actually be surprised how many phone calls I've gotten in the spring where guys would call and say, "Hey, my steering's not steering how it should. What's going on? It worked last fall or whatever." And 9 times out of 10, it would come down to 5-minute fix, whether it was cable or whether it was the calibration. Like I said, it just gives you a chance to address any issues that arise. And like I said, with all of us being strip tillers, we're expecting a lot more out of I feel like we're expecting a lot more out of our steering systems than most other guys would in a conventional tillage setup, just because everything has to be so much tighter and there's basically no room for error whatsoever. And like I said, um, the other most important thing to do is to do a roll calibration. And I've got some slides here, and a couple slides here, and we'll kind of go through that a little bit. Like I said, if your roll offset is incorrect, then obviously you're not going to be planting on top. You're not going to be planting next to the fertilizer where it needs to be. Believe it or not, roll offsets can change throughout the winter. For example, I just did our track machine that's on the corn planter yesterday, and the roll offset was off between 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch. Believe it or not, because I can't want to explain why this happens. It's just the gyros kind of sit there and settle over the winter, and stuff changes. But like I said, it's always a good idea to do your roll offsets every single year, regardless. It seems like too often I see it where the roll offset just gets done when the system is installed and then never gets touched again. So it's always a good idea to go through this every year. And like I said, this is pretty elementary to just make sure all displays and accessories or anything like that you have in the cab power up normally. Like I said, everybody's got a lot of add-on stuff on their planters nowadays. So there's a lot of different things that get powered up in the cab. So it's always nice to know that there's no issues with that as well. And obviously, as I said on the other machines, it's always a good idea just to go around, check for loose wires or hoses or anything like that may be rubbing against each other and potentially may cause a problem in the future. For those of you that have never really done a roll calibration or anything like that, I want to go through that real quick. So about the easiest way to do it is just strike an AV line out in the field, and when your tractor is basically 0 inches offline, just stop. And there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either drop a flag through the drawbar pin, or you can just kind of look at the tire track marks if it's a little soft out there. You then drive for a couple hundred yards, spin the tractor around, and go right back down your same tracks. And when you get to your flag, or when you get to the spot where you'd stopped before, kind of get out and take a look and see how far you are offline. And it varies by display, but pretty much all the precision farming systems on the market have some place in there where you can adjust the roll calibration. And like I said, this is something that we do every single year, probably about twice a year before we go to the field on every single machine, just to make sure that nothing has changed over the winter. If you're trying to do like a roll offset on implement steering system, it's going to be basically the same. You're just going to want to measure your cholesterol, or about the easiest thing to do is to just turn around and drive right down your same tracks. And you can usually see this pretty well by where the disc openers are running in relation to your last pass, and you can kind of make adjustments off of there. That's all I have for you today, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask them. I put my comment here at the end, so if there's anything that you guys think of or anything you'd like to learn more about, you can email me or find me on Twitter and all that good stuff. So.
Well, thanks a lot, Dave. Great detail, great information, and some good examples there of some lessons you've learned, some things to watch out for before getting into the field this spring. So we did have several questions come in here, so and have a little bit of time here, so I wanted to toss a couple of those your way. So one of the questions, and you alluded to obviously some of the setup on your planter, but question came in about strip tilling in corn and how you handle large amounts of residue. And obviously with the potential for rain or wind blowing it back onto the row and hurting that stand.
Yes, that's an excellent question, Jack. I can definitely go into that in further detail. And that's something that's kind of fun about strip till is you see a problem and you address it, and it's kind of fun because every single year it seems like we make a change here, we make several changes, and it just gets better and better every year. So we started out originally with just a standard knife-to-knife corn head, because that's kind of what everybody said that's all you needed. And we kind of found out that we were having some issues with our trash breakdown and things of that sort. So the first step we did is we actually installed Calmer BT chopping rolls on the head, and that actually helped tremendously because it was in little pieces. And the one thing that we found that the closing discs on the strip till machine would not grab those little pieces and throw them back up on top of the strip. So that was probably the first big upgrade we made. The second thing is this last fall we installed a Yetter Stock Devastator on our corn head. I'm actually, I don't know whether you guys know this or not, a few of you may, I'm actually a Yetter dealer, so they really wanted us to try one, and I thought that it would be a good concept. And that actually worked very well in conjunction with the Calmer chopping rolls, because we've got that residue. We're sizing that residue, plus the Yetter Stock Devastator is pressing it against the ground and basically pinning it to the ground. And like I said, it's kind of nice because then it also flattens all those stalks. You don't have to worry about them sticking up and getting into your wires and things of that sort. Probably the other thing that we've been playing around with and that we've noticed is since the adoption of cover crops on some of our fields that we've been keeping covered continuously, we've noticed as we build that soil biology, we've got a lot more microbes to eat the residue, so it starts to become less and less of an issue. So looking forward, I think that's going to be another key thing to our residue management program is covers and getting the micro population built up in our soils.
Great. Appreciate the detail on that answer. Another topic you mentioned earlier in your presentation was dealing with rocks in the field. And do you have any advice on how to best navigate those in terms of equipment or just, what are some best practices there?
So probably the first thing that we kind of learned the hard way early on is for example, our first strip till was a shank machine. And even though those shanks were only going 8 to 10 inches deep or something like that, not very deep in retrospect, I mean, they pretty much hooked and found every single rock we ever had in the field. So that was kind of a problem. Probably the biggest thing that can help with your rock population is number one, have equipment with all rolling ground engaging components, meaning like, for example, we're not really a fan of what I would call static ground engaging components, such as like a mole knife or something like that. That's why pretty much everything we have, with the Soil Warrior having an all coulter system, our side dress bar, well, it was coulters, but we switched to wide drops for simplicity. But at any rate, just having as many coulters in your setup as you possibly can is probably the best thing that I can tell you to eliminate the rock issue, because it seems like all shanks do in our soil, for example, is just bring up rocks. So that's probably the biggest thing that I can say.
All right. I had a couple of questions here come in related to closing wheels, and one of the attendees wants you to maybe talk a little bit about the types of soils you're planting into. It sounds like this individual is considering a spike closing wheel, but just not sure, kind of the approach they should take depending on the type of soil that they're going to best accommodate.
So that's actually one thing that I forgot to mention in my introduction is we're kind of in a unique location where we're at. We're not in that part of Illinois where every single field is perfectly flat and every single farm is the same soil type. In our location across where we farm, we're planting into everything from blow sand to blue clay. So that kind of gives us an opportunity to try what we do across a wide variety of soil types. Some of our fields, like I said, the blue clay is down here in what we call the swamp, which has drainage ditches basically every square mile. There's a drainage ditch. So I mean, it's that wet, it's that heavy. Whereas that we do have farms too, where, for example, there was a new farm that we just picked up that's basically just blow sand. And if you stand there, I know there was a picture I put on Twitter or something like that, planting beans there last, and you really can't tell if we're in Illinois or in Australia. The soil is just so terrible looking. But like I said, it's kind of one of those things that it'll take some time to get that built back up to where it needs to be. And then we also have, pretty much everything in between and some timber soil and things of that. And that's kind of one thing that I like about the spike closing wheels is especially the ones that we're using is they perform consistently across all of our soil types, where it seems like before we were always constantly adjusting pressure and tweaking them a little bit to try and make a smooth closing wheel work everywhere. And the thing I do like about the Yetter ones, they're kind of unique in the market to a certain degree, just because they're not only packing the seed trench, but they have kind of a twisting action to them as well, which I think they, in my personal opinion, the twisting action kind of adds one more thing that kind of makes them work just a little bit better across several different soil types.
Sure. Following up on that, another question we had was, are you seeing a difference in closing wheel performance with conventional till or strip till? And I don't know if that's something you could speak to, but second part of that question was, how necessary do you think a spike closing wheel is in strip till?
So here again, one thing I'd like to say, this could potentially be kind of a here and there thing that we always talk, that I know several growers always talk about, but in my personal opinion, the spike closing wheel is just as important in conventional tillage as it is in strip till. As a little disclaimer, we actually have a couple hundred acres of conventional tillage that we do for a farm manager, just because that's just the way they want it done, period. Unfortunately, so with that being said, we always get to kind of compare everything we do on a conventional tillage side as well. And the reason I say that they're just as important in conventional tillage is just because with conventional tillage, no matter how good of a field cultivator you have, no matter how the ground worked up, it just seems like it's never very consistent. And the spike closing wheel helps to even out that inconsistency to a certain degree. Now on the flip side, in strip till, after running the spike closing wheels, I do feel like they are a very important piece of the planter. Mainly because of sometimes the conditions in strip till can get a little bit tougher depending on how well you made your fall strips or how well you made your spring strips. So it's just kind of another one of those things. To me, it's more of a even under ideal conditions, it's more of an extra insurance policy to make sure that seed trench is closed up as good as it possibly can be.
Good. I think we had one more here. Looking for any tricks or tips you might have for keeping the planter on the berm.
So probably the first thing, and I know I kind of spent a lot of time talking about this, is make sure that your roll calibration on your tractor is absolutely positively as perfect as it can be. The second thing to consider is, once you've got your roll calibration done on your tractor, go out in the field. I should say go out in the flattest field that you have and make some passes back and forth. and make sure that your planter is tracking where it should be. And if it's not, put an offset in to account for the draft. Believe it or not, I have customers that I've worked with over the years down in central Illinois, perfectly flat as can be, all fairly new planters and strip till machines and stuff like that. And even those guys have to put in, they may have to put in a 3-inch offset or a 4-inch offset or whatever it may be to keep their guest rows consistent. Those are the easiest ways to do it. The other thing is that some of you know that I'm kind of a big fan on is if you want to make the investment, implement steering is an excellent way to ensure that everything stays where it needs to be. As of this year, we'll have some form of active implement guidance on the strip till machine and both of our planters. And we've got various ways. They're all Trimble TrueTracker systems, but there's various ways that we are steering the planters. For example, one has a LaForge hitch, the other one has a hitch that I designed and fabricated myself, and then the Soil Warrior has an integrated steerable tongue. So that's something else that if you feel like you're to that point and you want to make the investment, that's probably the best way to do it, in my personal opinion, if you want to make the investment.
Well, great. Well, Dave, thanks again. That's all the time we have for today's program, but a reminder to attendees that today's presentation and audio will be made available on striptillfarmer.com, so you can look for it if there's some additional tips or you'd like to revisit some of Dave's comments here today. Just a quick invitation as well for everyone to join us at the 5th Annual National Strip Tillage Conference. And that's going to be coming up on July 26th and 27th in Iowa City, Iowa. And our 2018 event is going to again feature a mix of general sessions, classrooms, and roundtable discussions on topics and trends specific to strip till. So look for speaker announcements and conference updates at striptillconference.com. Well, on behalf of Dave Delotel, Topcon Agriculture, and our entire staff here with Strip Till Farmer, thanks again for joining us today for this live webinar event.